Morning Algebra, we're going to do a lesson on completing the square. This is a little bit of a tougher one, so if you're distracted, not a good time to do this. I want you to get this in your heads because we'll use it tomorrow. Okay, so completing the square. If you remember from the end of chapter 8, I think it was, if we had something like x squared plus 6x plus 9. You could look at that and you could see that this is going to be a perfect square binomial because the square root of this is 1, the square root of this is 3, 1 times 3, and then we double it and we get that middle term. So this is going to break down to x plus 3 squared. Do you remember doing that? Well, this works great if you have a perfect square already, but it doesn't work so well if we don't. Let's say that we started with x squared plus 6x. Well, let's just do a different one. X squared plus 8x. What could we add to this to make this a perfect square? Well, let me give you one hint. First of all, this needs to be a 1 here. Okay? If that's not a 1, this is going to kind of mess you up later on. So if it needs to be, you can divide it out. But for ours, it's a 1 coefficient here. So we look at this coefficient, that 8. And if you remember what we did is we took this 1 and we multiplied it by this, and then we doubled it to get this, right? So let's work backwards. What's half of that? 4. And then we're going to square that and get 16 here. So let's try it again. Square root of this is 1, square root of this is 4, 1 times 4 is 4, and then we double it and get 8. So do you see how that makes a perfect square? And again, just to emphasize, this would be x plus 4 squared. All right, so that's not that useful. What's more useful is what they say in the next section. This is solving an equation with this. So let's say they gave you that something, x squared, and let's do it, I'll pick a different one, 10x equals 13, let's say. Well, you look at this and you say, well, I'm not going to be able to solve that right now. So I'm going to solve it by completing the square. Let me give you a little more room here. So do you remember how let's just worry about not this side, let's just worry about this side right now. Do you remember how we make this a perfect square? We make sure this is a 1. We take half of that, which is 5, and we square it. And 25 would work there, right? Now, if we're going to add 25 to this side, we need to add 25 to the other side as well to balance the equation. The usefulness of this is now we can write this x plus 5 squared equals 38. And to solve our equation then, if we have something squared, you know what, 38 is a bad number. Can I just repick? What if I had 11 here to begin with? And then this would be 36. This is going to be a little better. It's just going to work out easier. So now do you see a way we can solve this? If we take the square root of this side, we're going to get rid of that squared. And if we take the square root of one side, we've got to take the square root of the other. Square root of this gets rid of that, and gets rid of that, so we're just going to end up with x plus 5. And the square root of 36 is 6, but if you remember, it's also negative 6. Just negative 6 times negative 6 equals 36 also. And now we simply solve this equation. Now there's really two equations here. There's x plus 5 equals negative 6, and x plus 5 equals 6. Can you see that? Let me make sure. So if I take this away, I get x equals 1. If I take this away, I get x equals negative 11. And so those are my two answers. So let me just review what I did. I had an equation that was not a perfect square. I made it a perfect square by adding something here, and that something was half of this squared. When I added something to this side, I also added something to the right side. I can rewrite this now as the squared binomial. And after I do that, I can take the square root of this side and the square root of this side. The square root of this side gets rid of that squared, leaves me with the original binomial. And the square root of the right side is actually two numbers. It's going to be a positive and a negative, and then I just solve. I understand that's kind of a lot, so why don't we practice one, okay? Okay, so let's try a different one, just so you can practice. I'll try to get some good numbers this time. Let's do, I don't know, x squared minus 18 equals negative 75. Okay? You try it at home. Stop the tape and give it a shot. Okay, how'd you do? All right. First of all, we check and make sure this is a 1. It is. If this was not a 1, if this was a 2, for instance, then you're going to need to divide every single person by 2 to get that to be a 1. Since it's a 1, we can go from there. Look at this and take half of it. Half of that would be negative 9, correct? We square that. That gives you 81. If we add 81 to this side, we have to add 81 to the right side also. This is now a perfect square, so I can rewrite it as x minus 9 squared. And I can rewrite this as positive 16. Next step, I want to get rid of that squared, so I can take the square root and the square root of the right side. That leaves me x minus 9 equals positive and negative 4. So really this is two equations. X minus 9 equals 4 and x minus 9 equals negative 4. I just simply solve those, bring that over, x equals 13. Bring this over, x equals 5, and those are my two answers. One little thing to be aware of. Occasionally, you're going to get some weirdo problem, and maybe even more than occasionally. But after we do the whole thing, it's going to end up being something like the square root of, I don't know, x minus 1 equals negative 3. Do you see it? Okay, so do you see if I take the square root of this, that'll give me x minus 1. But the problem is you can't ever take the square root of a negative number. So at that point, you can just stop and just simply say there's no solutions. Okay, so one thing to be aware of. Sometimes it'll give you just simply one solution. If this was a 0 here, let's just do this. Turns out to be x minus 1 equals 0. There's no positive and negative 0, so when I add the 1, x equals 1, I'll get one solution. So here's your choices. You can either have two solutions, one solution, or no solutions. All right. That's completing the square. Hope it made sense.